What I want to do in this lesson is talk about Christian views on sexual relationships. We're going to talk about different denominations of Christianity and their positions on different types of sexual relationships that can exist. And so, really, so far, what we've been doing is placing our Christian understandings that we have looked at in previous lessons, and we've been talking about it within the concept of families and relationships. And we've been talking about these specific ideas of families and relationships within the confines of, for example, marriage and the concept of the more nuclear family. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is take these very same understandings of families and relationships and Christian tradition and try and see how these Christians approach other kinds of sexual relationships. So relationships that are not within the traditional settings of the family, the traditional settings of potentially the sacrament of marriage, but instead looking at different types of relationships that could exist in the world. And the first, and arguably most controversial for some Christian denominations, is that of the concept of same-sex marriage, or for example, homosexual marriages and relationships that can exist. So the vast majority of Christian denominations believe that the act of marriage itself is not just the act of union and the commitment of two individuals, but the two individuals in question have to be a man and a woman. So marriage has to take place between a man and a woman. And so therefore there is no place for the belief in the concept of same-sex marriage, i.e. two men getting married or two women getting married. So when it comes to the legal approaches to same-sex marriage, you'll be surprised at just how late in the 21st century that we got before same-sex marriage would become legal. So in England and Wales, same-sex marriage would become legal in 2014. But there was a lot of backlash from a lot of different churches, from conservative groups, and just from a lot of individuals around the country, to be fair. I remember it very fondly as a very ridiculously controversial period of time, despite the fact that it was, of course, a win for progressive ideas and a win for the LGBT movement as a whole, even though it came with a lot of backlash and a lot of angry people not very happy. Now, both the Catholic Church and the Church of England are not permitted to carry out same-sex marriages. So even the relatively liberal Church of England, that we will see as has quite liberal approaches to different kind of relationships, do not permit the carrying out of same-sex marriages. And there are circumstances whereby same-sex marriages are carried out within members of the Church of England, but these marriages are not conducted by the Church of England. So same-sex marriage is still something that is ridiculously controversial within different religious traditions, even to this day. Now, the majority of the very vocal opposition, of course, exists within the Catholic Church. They are wholly opposed to the idea of allowing same-sex marriage due to the fact that they view the practice of the sacrament of marriage, it is a sacrament within Catholic and Orthodox traditions, as we know already. They view that as something which will undermine the moral integrity of society, and that it is seen as generally a more, it's more indicative of a general understanding and a general approach that the Catholic Church takes to the idea of same-sex relationships as a whole, as something that is sinful, as something that the Bible teaches against, and as something that ought to be not necessarily outlawed, but ought to be argued against in society. Now, they also believe that same-sex marriage has the effect of undermining the importance of the traditional heterosexual marriage and heterosexual relationship. So by so-called allowing same-sex marriage to take place within the Catholic tradition, they have the belief that this would undermine heterosexual marriages. Quite why they believe that and quite why that is the case is something that is particularly interesting to ask that kind of question. But whatever, that is the belief that they have. You can tell that you can sort of tell my own beliefs are translating into this understanding of same-sex marriage here, but it's obviously easy to understand these different approaches by these different Christian denominations. Now, So far, we've talked about the Church of England and the Catholic Church as being generally either generally opposed or very, very wholly opposed to the concept of same-sex marriage. But this is not the case in all Christian denominations. There are some that do actually allow for the existence of same-sex marriages. So, for example, in June 2015, the relatively niche and esoteric Episcopal Church voted to change their law to allow for same-sex marriages. So this is an example of, albeit a very relatively niche denomination of Christianity, allowing for the existence of same-sex marriages within their confines. The sort of get-around clause that we have or had before the introduction of same-sex marriages within the law was the concept of civil partnerships. So this was the idea that existed before the legal introduction of same-sex marriage in England and Wales, because essentially what this was an alternative for same-sex couples, and essentially it was de facto a marriage. It was the same as a marriage in most things except for name, and in other small instances as well. And it was the idea that to try and appease both religious organizations and to try and appease LGBT movements and equality movements, to try and allow for civil partnerships to exist so that everybody is happy instead. And this became legal in December 2005. They were to represent a union between homosexual couples, but they were not performed by either the Church of England, nor were they performed by the Catholic Church as well. Now, while in 2005, and something that on paper is a relatively forward-looking and progressive approach to the concept of LGBT issues, it is of course still discriminatory to have two different systems, and so that even if they act very, very similar, almost akin to a marriage, it is still discriminatory to allow for them to even exist across two systems, because it still is the case that homosexual couples couldn't get married even if they were allowed to have civil partnerships, which in and of itself is discrimination. So previously, vicars who sought to enter into civil partnerships were permitted to do so, but they were told to remain celibate if they chose to do so as well. So again, more very discriminatory actions. I don't know how they could regulate that either, but again, all of these different things relating to the concept of civil partnerships. And of course, we see that this is outlawed or reformed, should I say. This kind of law is reformed in 2014. And the attitudes towards same-sex marriage is improving every single year, which is always good to see. So now we focused on the concept of same-sex marriage. What about the concept of premarital sex? The idea that people having sex before marriage. And we're going to talk about this a little bit when we talk about abstinence in more detail. But in Catholic traditions, it is generally seen that sexual relationships outside the sacrament of marriage is morally wrong. The reason for this is because God gave the gift of sex for the purposes of reproduction and for the purposes of, and for the benefit, should I say, of two individuals who are married to each other. And so to act in a way that is not in accordance with that gift, i.e. to have sex outside of the sacrament of marriage, or to have sex for the purposes that is not relating to that of procreation, i.e. to have sex using contraception, is morally wrong. And we'll get to that, like I said, when we talk about contraception in more detail. But there are other traditions that are slightly more relaxed in their views of sex outside of marriage. So, for example, the Church of England, according to the Church of England, it is seen that premarital sex as well as cohabitation, i.e. living with another individual, are both relatively natural processes which can lead to one to engage in the act of marriage in the future. And in reality, this more liberal approach to both premarital sex and cohabitation will allow for and facilitate more successful marriages in the future. If you can't live with the person and have sex with the person before you marry them, then that could lead to a situation and lead to a circumstance whereby you're more likely to get a divorce or want to get a divorce or have your marriage annulled as the result of the fact that you don't particularly like the individual because you didn't have the experience of living with them and having this premarital sex beforehand to actually come to a conclusion as to whether or not that person is right for you. Again, within the Church of England tradition, This more liberal approach of allowing for cohabitation and allowing for premarital sex allows for one to have more successful marriages in the future. Now, the concept of celibacy is the act of refraining from both marriage as well as any kind of other sexual or romantic relationship. So, one reason for celibacy is to focus all of their time on attention, on the serving and loving of God. And there have been a number of allegedly famous individuals within Christian history who have remained celibate. I put allegedly there because, of course, you can't ever know. So, for example, John the Apostle was allegedly celibate. I believe also Thomas Aquinas fits that category as well. And within church practice, there is the requirement that priests in Catholic denominations are celibate, and this will extend to both monks and nuns, as you can probably imagine. Now, the argument being that those who are priests are better equipped to serve God if they do not have to waste time focusing on marriage and relationships and their own kind of human interactions with other individuals within the confines of marriage or sexual relationships. If they don't have to worry about any of that, then they can better serve God, and they can better equip themselves to serve and to love God instead. Again, all of these different ideas tend to be still acting within the Catholic tradition. They tend not to be as prominent in other denominations. Of course, they are very prominent in some quite niche denominations. Again, there are so many different varying traditions of Christianity that there are lots of different ways in which we approach these ideas. And so it's obviously important that we highlight the main denominations, the Orthodox. We have the Catholic and the Church of England, for example.